All right, welcome to the second session of B2B podcasting. So, we were having our own technical challenges behind the scenes, and we got it all sorted out, and now we're live. But this is a part of, Chris, I think this is a good sort of example, at least for me, with live podcasting, because it's like the best example of like the things that happen.
Yeah, well, I'm going to apologize to the whole audience because the technical challenge was in here.
No.
I clicked on a link on the invitation that was different than the actual address. So that was me.
Well, we're all here now, and I mean, I noticed that there were actually quite a few people that had signed up. As we go through sort of our presentation here and things like that, if you want to like check in with us and let us know who's online. I don't typically have LinkedIn up whenever we're live because if I'm not careful, it'll cause an echo. I've learned that through lots of experience. And then, I mean, we're going to cover a lot of great topics here today. And I was actually getting some great sort of pre-event engagement from folks just saying, hey, look, I'm going to be on and I'm excited about the event. And so I'm glad we're all here and everything worked out.
Yeah. Looking forward to it.
So for the person that just said, I'm here, if you wouldn't mind, so I get on my end, it just says LinkedIn user. So I guess I should have clarified that. If you could put in who it is, that would help me on my end because the message that I receive, unless I'm, fully logged in and you're fully logged in, then I just get a kind of blank LinkedIn user, which is kind of hard, but thanks for confirming that somebody's here and listening as well. So I appreciate that also. So just let me kind of bring us back in terms of the things that we were talking about in the last session. So in the last session, we actually covered why you would create a B2B podcast. So, I mean, I was actually trying to look up some statistics while we were working out, some of the technical challenges. One of the things that I ran across is a statistic that says that only still 1% of the LinkedIn users that are out there are creators. Now, this may be a little dated because I'm seeing like more and more activity now on LinkedIn. I feel like there's a lot more people that are going live and talking about things. But I mean, this idea of, using a platform where 1% of people are actually leveraging it as a creator, as somebody that's, kind of engaging their audience is something that's unique. The other statistic that also I would remind people of is 42% of LinkedIn users use LinkedIn to drive traffic to their website. And so LinkedIn is saying, hey, look, there's quite a large portion of our audience that goes from LinkedIn back to your website. And so 42% of us, sort of look people up and then we'll go from LinkedIn back to their websites. And oftentimes I even do that whenever I don't know, the direct company's, address. I'll go from the individual back. And so, why should you think about creating a B2B podcast? One, I don't think there are a lot of people leveraging the platform this way. And two, there are a lot of people that are using it to go find businesses and things like that. So in this session, then we're going to cover more of the content and formats to consider. So some of the formats that, that you can think about in terms of the way that you're going to format your podcast and things like that as well. So Chris, you want to cover this one?
Yeah, so the quick outline for today is we're going to talk about your audience and how to think about your audience, what they want, and so on. Then we're going to roll through some content types and topics, the things that you might talk about on your podcast. And of course, these aren't specific topics, but broadly, how do you think about what the content of your podcast would be? And then we'll discuss a few different formats because there are many ways to do it. Anything you can imagine is probably possible, depending on the level of complication you're willing to tolerate. But for the most part, podcasting can be very simple regardless of your format, but you can have as many people involved as you might imagine.
Yeah, and I mean, these are all good things to really consider as well as you're getting started, because as much as you can make a change, the more that you know as you get started, the better as well. So, yeah. So, in terms of your audience, and thinking about your audience, who are they? Um, you know, what is it that they do, and what do they want and need potentially from your organization? One of the people that's on, I know, is Kim Hightower. I saw your hello on here as well. And so I think about companies like Valid Care, who has a unique, or more or less cutting edge product in the marketplace in terms of um, clinical trials and what they do. And with that, um, there are lots of people that are out, getting ready to go start a clinical trial, or even, ones that are thinking about potentially taking a different approach at clinical trials. And so getting started with them now would be, really critical as well. Um, what'll keep them coming back is really focused on, sort of this continued audience engagement, right? So what sort of things should you be thinking about in terms of, the things that continue to attract the audience and make them come back? Chris, do you have anything that you would highlight in terms of this particular item?
I would just say that you should think about a theme, and be somewhat consistent in what you're going to put out. So it's it's okay to do some testing. I do some testing, but for example, my main podcast, Life Science Marketing Radio, the target audience was marketers in life science, and I was trying to help them by speaking to other people so that they might get ideas about different things they should do, but not just that. So I stretched out a little bit and started getting into leadership topics, because if you're a marketer, you've got a team maybe, and you need to know how to recruit the right people for your team and how to manage that team and so on. So a little bit about leadership and so on. So I just think you want to have something where people kind of know roughly what to expect from you in every episode, that it's not so much all over the map that they have no idea and only a fraction of it's going to be useful, because they're probably not going to come back in that way.
Yeah, it's been one of the things that I know that a lot of podcasters also get challenged with, is like, how broad do they go? How narrow do they go? Especially in life sciences, right? So it's like, there's a lot that we can cover, but there's also, an expectation, I believe, that the audience has. Um, One of the things that I've also been told, which is a really interesting one to me. So I was swimming laps one morning after listening to a podcast, and I happened to just finish, sort of turning around, and the idea of having a consistent 3 questions in my podcast came to mind. Don't know if it was the lack of oxygen or just the cold water or what it was that morning, but so essentially, I've had people tell me as well that the one reason why they stick around to the very end is really to hear the leaders, answer these spontaneous questions at the end of the podcast as well, and just trying to see what direction people will go, because I honestly have no idea how people are going to answer those questions either, in my podcast. So, yeah.
And I think that's the element of consistency. That's a great idea. So people, there's an expectation, regardless of whatever else is in your episode. People want to stick around for that. They know it's coming. It's kind of a treat for people who stick out through the whole thing. Um, I'll take the next point, which kind of ties into that. I mean, the three basic things that anyone gets out of a podcast are education, inspiration, and entertainment. And if you can get at least two of those, you're probably going to do okay. If it's only one thing, if it's pure entertainment and no education, maybe. And if it's just inspirational, that might get tiresome after a while as well. But if you can get two, and especially three of those, you should think about it like a TV show or a Netflix series. You want people to be bought into it. And I would say, in terms of what the audience needs, I always encourage people, don't think about your product or your service. Think about your audience and all the things sort of related to their job that would be of interest to them. And I was just writing something this morning, and it came to me that products are useful, but people are fascinating. I mean, you will never get tired of listening to someone with an interesting story. Um, and it doesn't have to be anything about your product, but it can be someone who a person in your audience can relate to and see themselves in that situation.
Yeah, I agree with that. And yeah, and so I'll take the last one. So the call to action really is, sort of that final focus that you're going to have in terms of, what is it that you want people to do with the information that they're getting. The interesting thing for me, and I would be interested in hearing your perspective on this as well, Chris, is that, I mean, in terms of like the main sort of mainstays for life science success anyway, the idea really is to spotlight the companies that we're talking about, right? So it's not necessarily about me and my consulting services. It's not about, other sort of things that are related to me. And so what I sort of envision is that the life science marketplace is so big that it's very hard to understand what's going on at any one point in time. To me, there are lots of different sort of takeaways that somebody could have from one show. One person that called me this last week about a recent interview was, hey, I saw the person that was on your show, and I definitely think that they could benefit from connecting with me. And that really is something that I could envision life science success being. But also, I could see it being that the person that is presenting on the show offers a service that somebody else needs, right? So there, for me, I wouldn't say that there's a specific call to action, but I definitely think that this is something that, a lot of podcasts do have a very specific call to action for people.
Yeah, so I'm not selling Casper mattresses or Hello Fresh on my podcast. My typical call to action, I really only have one because I'm just trying to grow the audience and build those relationships so people keep coming back and more of them keep coming back. And because in a B2B podcast, you're probably focused on a fairly narrow group of people, that if someone is enjoying your podcast, they should tell their friends. And so that's my call to action for every single episode is, hey, if you like this, you're probably sitting in a cubicle next to someone else who would benefit from the same thing. And so try to get them to just spread the word. And then hopefully they might at some point say, hey, I wonder what Chris does. But to your point about, people calling and making connections, that's definitely something that you'll be able to do as you grow your podcast, because you'll have met so many people. I've had, I published a podcast one morning, and before I had a chance to share it on LinkedIn, someone had messaged me to ask for the contact information of the guest that was on that day. So um, it happens.
Yep. Yeah, and I've had people say after my show that they've had either VC firms reach out or private equity firms reach out to invest in them if they're specifically looking for investment. So I've had people say that. I've also had people reach out to me with regards to strategic partnerships and things like that directly with my consulting organization. So those have all been benefits, like I would say almost side benefits of this, quote unquote umbrella call to action. So yeah, I agree with you. All right. So I had trouble with this slide the last time because of the video background. There we go. So possible topics. You want to start us off?
Sure. So this is the easiest one. And of course, this is very broad, but what's going on in your industry? I mean, you can be sort of a source of information about that, and you don't have to be the source, but simply by talking to a number of people in your industry, your audience will get a sense of where things are going, what's a hot topic, what do people care about, and so on. So that's always useful. and then and success and failure. So this is pure storytelling. If you get someone on your podcast and you're interviewing them, they have some journey that they're making, whether it's for their career or specifically with their job right now, or they're growing a company. There are bits of success and failure everywhere you look. And if you can figure out how to pull that story out of people, that's always going to be interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's funny to me because I mean, with the I don't know what your thoughts are about my show name, but with the show name Life Science Success, I had one particular leader that I reached out to with regards to being a guest. I thought he would be a really interesting guest, and his comment was, "To be successful in life sciences, you must be a god." And you know, people have heard me sort of reiterate this throughout shows that I've had, because it kind of stuck with me that, you know, somebody would ever think, you know, because to me the term overnight success came to mind instantly, because many of us have heard this term overnight success, but anytime that you look at the background of whoever it was that was actually successful, you find very quickly that individual went through a lot of sort of trials and tribulations along the way. So, you know, getting people to tell both sides of the story and kind of their journey is really, you know, overall what I envision life science success to be about. And that's similar sort of, you know, thought in terms of that previous point, the success and failure.
Yeah, I'm
Highlighting.
publishing. Oh, God.
Go ahead.
I'm
No, go ahead.
sorry. Jump
No,
in
no,
there.
go ahead.
Tomorrow's episode on Life Science Marketing Radio is one of those stories about pivoting. And
Yeah.
in fact, every biotech, I wrote in the blog post, if you meet someone who hasn't had to pivot and has had a successful company, congratulate them, because they're rare. But it's an interesting story. If someone had a great idea, it didn't quite work out, they shifted, and now they're on their way. It's
Yeah. And I think
and
it
it's some interesting stuff.
across the industries and especially in life sciences, this is a tough, tough place to be, you know, as well. In terms of highlighting best practices, the best practices, you know, that you could cover would be, you know, key things that people are doing that others might consider as well. And then there's also an opportunity to do things like, you know, having podcast topics that are more case studies as well. So you're, you know, sort of deep diving, you know, into a particular area as well.
Yeah, I now I'm thinking a case study just popped into my head. I interviewed someone a couple years ago who was telling the story of Viagra, which and how they essentially rebranded um, impotence, which is a word that no one wants to hear, to erectile dysfunction. And that whole story is a case study in kind of renaming the problem
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
how without that, probably not the success that it has been. Right.
Right. Yeah.
Um, are we on to leadership and career advice? I already mentioned this. So this is always interesting. I mean, if people are tuning into podcasts to learn, they already have a learning mentality. So hearing stories about leadership or just how to advance your career, how do you find a mentor, why you should be a mentor, all those things are always interesting. I mean, there's so many uh, people talking about it on LinkedIn to begin with, but it's kind of an open-ended topic. Everybody's going to have something to share that's worthwhile.
Yeah, and I have to think that there's you know, kind of a broad number of topics that you could cover under, you know, leadership and career advice. Interestingly enough, I'm in another group that's looking at, you know, sort of different areas that consultants are building out inside of their practices, and one of the consultants there is focused on kind of the DEI, so the diversity and inclusion space, but then he specifically only focuses in on menopause, so menopause care inside of DEI. And I was like, I mean, you talk about a you know, big challenge, but at the same time, I kind of think about, you know, these topics, not just leadership and career advice, but also, you other things that sort of touch people on a broad spectrum as well.
Yeah, I was going to throw DE and I in there as a very popular topic, and there's plenty to talk about there and plenty of people who can share their experience. Your menopause example, I would just say that if you scrolled through Apple Podcasts, there is no topic that is too niche for a podcast. Like
Right.
you might not have the largest audience, but you will have a committed audience if this is something people care about.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you and I have talked about this idea of news before. So, whenever I think about like a news related podcast, that you could have topics inside of, one specific industry. So let's just say, life sciences, since both of us are kind of in this space, but I mean, you could do it for, any industry that's out there. And then I think keeping it interesting would be, one, a challenge, but also staying up to date on what's coming at you is not an easy thing. I mean, all of these guys that do, even political news, whenever they do the political news, sort of podcast, I think about what a challenge it must be, because things, as you're talking about them, are again changing, and you're having to research, kind of the next round of topics as well.
Right. I'm not an expert in this area. I think a short news podcast, I do know from someone who's been on my podcast, Tom Fox, that if you were to publish something every day, you will go up in the rankings,
Yeah.
certainly, and you can become the source. So it doesn't have to be long. You could do a 5 to 10 minute run through of the news by setting up a bunch of Google alerts, pick out the stories, give a quick summary of what's going on, and put links below in the show notes, or no links, but people would say, "Oh, okay, I'm sort of keeping up with what's going on there." So um, that requires probably a different kind of person to host that thing, but I think it could be very worthwhile. And since we're talking B2B, certainly a way to put your brand on something that's going to be, the the if not the reach, the frequency will be high.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned an important point a second ago. Not that we had talked about this before, but I mean, so my podcast used to be Wednesdays at 5 o'clock Eastern time. Was when the show went live, and so that we would have a way to backfill potential future episodes. I started recording another one on Thursday mornings, and so that one wouldn't oftentimes be broadcast. It would just be banked, right, for the times that somebody couldn't make the 5 o'clock or whatever. And so I went, because of the amount of interest in people wanting to be guests and things like that on the podcast. I more or less just decided that, look, I just need to start doing the Thursday morning live, because there's enough interest in people being guests that I'm never going to get these things out there. People are going to be waiting forever for their episode to go live. And so when I did that, there was another bump in viewers or listeners. And so it was really interesting to me to watch sort of the metrics. And like you're saying, if you had a 5 day a week, or heaven forbid a 7 day a week news show, it would probably would have a fair amount of viewership or listenership.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then lastly, on the technology, there's a lot of interesting technology on both sides of most industries, both from the people who are using it as well as the people who are creating it, right? So you could, focus in terms of topics, you could focus the topics around the technology that's being used, but you could also certainly, cover, like the engineering side of things. And there are lots of podcasts on engineering products, but at the same time, they're in every single industry. I feel like they have challenges. And in our industry, whenever you bring in, all of the additional regulatory challenges, those are other things that, oftentimes wouldn't be covered by, let's say, the most popular technology, kind of podcast. So
Right. On technology, I would just say that certainly what's interesting about technology to me, and I think maybe, I hope most people, but I won't assume that, is the story of what was the problem, and what were the challenges of making it happen, and what can it be used for, as opposed to, hey, here's this new technology and it can do this and this and this, which would sound salesy whether it was yours or not. But technology is fascinating in how it comes about, what it can do, giving people a vision of the future and what that will look like. I think so. If you frame it right and learn how to go take the listener on that journey around the technology, that can be a winner.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So formats to consider. You want to kick us off?
Sure. So I'm going to say that the first one might be the hardest, depending on your personality. But to do a solo podcast, first of all, you have to prepare a fair amount of material, depending on the length you're going to do. Maybe if it's a news podcast, that's certainly the thing. But if you were to say, I'm going to talk for 30 minutes every week or every other week, you have to put something together in an organized fashion. And for me personally, just maintaining the energy to deliver something without having some other person in front of you, or even just audio only to go back and forth with, would be a challenge. But certainly that's a doable thing. And then, so a co host, by that, what we mean is, I believe, Don, correct me if I'm wrong, two people consistently on the podcast, not necessarily any guests, right?
Right. Right. Yeah, it would be more like what we're doing here, right? um, sharing the stage back and forth, having some level of conversation, like you said. I've seen many people that are, very good solo podcasters as well. I mean, they have this sort of idea, look, I'm going to share an educational portion, during the beginning part of the show. I'm going to engage the audience kind of in the middle. And there's going to be sort of this back and forth on the end, right? Where they do, people submitting questions or whatever, and then the person, answering them. I've seen that, you know, be really successful either solo or co-hosted. Um, the most terrifying thing to me is this idea of me getting my face on the screen solo alone and having a topic and stage all by myself, unless I really did have an educational sort of offering, right? I mean, if I had a typical sort of we talked about the non-webinar topic, right, where I've come really to share this one thing with you, and we're going to sort of have a decent sized group of people that are engaged. That's one thing. But whenever it is truly solo, and you're on the stage by yourself, and you don't know how much engagement on the back end that you're going to get, it could be pretty anxiety building. And I would think having that co-host sort of, at least for me anyway, divides up that attention a little bit.
Right. I think, the ideal co host situation is where people are having an actual conversation, and don't know necessarily what the other person's going to say, but they both know, all right, the topic we're going to talk about today is, and Don, I want to find out what you think about X, Y, and Z. And then we go back and forth that way. The interview is the simplest, probably the most basic format for a podcast. It's what I do the most of, I enjoy the most, and of course, if the benefits that we were talking about last week are building your network, shining a light on customers, finding prospective customers, or just educating people by making connections to new people to interview and having them share their thoughts with your audience, this is the simplest thing. And um, it's I enjoy it a lot. I've talked to a couple hundred people in the last 8 years, and always learn something new, and then growing the network. This this course is a result of that as well. So I think that's and people. I think the magic of an interview is that people put themselves in the room with you, and they feel like they're part of that conversation. They're not being spoken to, they're listening in on something else as if they were there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think, um, it gives you non-sales way to reach out to people as well, and kind of build that network so that you have, kind of an engaged audience throughout time as well of, a lot of the things that you're sort of putting out there. Um, the panel discussion. So there was a liquid biopsy panel discussion that we had. We've also had AI panel discussions on my show as well. And for me, that watching kind of the dynamic of, let's say, 3 or 4 people, right? So you're trying to sort of navigate this amongst time, with the questions. A panel discussion has to just be more planned out, I feel like. I would say it's a bit more work in terms of trying to make sure that you're working through that, the key topics that you're going to cover and who's speaking when. If there's going to be a rotation, what is that rotation? And then, just making sure that you give, more or less equal time to the panel is a nice challenge for any sort of moderation in terms of the discussion. On the flip side, though, the audience for all of the panel discussions that I've had on Life Science Success have been very engaged. So one will have a lot more live participants, join, but then also on the back end, the people that listen and re-listen to those episodes seems to be, pretty high as well. I mean, so we seem to have a lot of audience engagement from that as well.
Nice. Yeah, I think that's a panel is great. If you're prepared, it might be a little less work for the host other than managing the interactions. Something that was suggested to me by one of my listeners once, who's more in the healthcare advertising world, but to put 2 thought leaders, in this case, he was speaking about doctors, just in a room, and then throw out topics to them and just listen to them going back and forth with each other, right? Which is something I'm still looking to set up somehow. I think I have one idea of something, of a topic for that, from previous guests who weren't on at the same time. So
Yeah, I was on a panel where they gave us opposing topics. It was supposed to be one of us opposing the other one, and what I found was that myself and the other guest oftentimes agreed. And so it was kind of a challenge for the moderator because they wanted us to take an opposing path, but yeah, given the topics that they gave us, it was really hard to sort of, you know say that you were, for or against, something that, just didn't make any sense. And so you
right.
just, yeah, those sort of things, again, if you're wanting sort of this, friction to develop, you probably are going to have to be more thoughtful of who's on the panel and how, what sort of starting position do they have, and does that position, contribute or take away from where you want to go with the episode as well. And so, I mean, a good example, I guess, could be, in terms of, um, clinical trials. One thought might be, do you support or, not support, certain methods in terms of clinical trials that happen, in clinical studies. And I mean, I think, you could have people that oppose certain things, but again, if that opposition, would be, sort of portrayed, against something else that they would normally do, it'd be hard for them to get on a show and sort of represent that position, I would imagine. So yeah.
Yeah, you want to get the authentic, position out of anybody, right? And raise all the viewpoints, and while avoiding misinformation. I'll just throw that in there. But
Yeah.
last one on the list is a narrative podcast. So if you've listened to Serial, or if you're into true crime stories, that's sort of what we're talking about, where someone has put together essentially an audio story, or maybe it's more self-contained. It doesn't have to be a series, but a self-contained episode where you've gone out and you've interviewed a few different people. I've done this for a couple of different topics, where maybe I get a product manager, a user, and then someone from a third party that would have an opinion about something. I interview them all and I put the story together so it flows more like you would hear on an NPR radio show. That's a bit more work, but I I really enjoy making those. I enjoy listening to them, and I think they have just a different level of. It's just a different level of production.
Yeah. Yeah, the very first podcast that I fell in love with was more of the co-hosted version. But then Serial came along, and I remember, just sort of falling in love with, that show. And then we talked about the last time that I am a true crime fan as well. So can't can't help it. But yeah, I mean, for me, either walking or quiet time alone, those sort of things. I oftentimes will have a podcast playing as well. So yeah. So let's talk about some of the obstacles. Chris, you want to start us off here?
Sure. So the first one is going to be finding someone in your company or outside of your company who can be a skilled and engaging host. So they know how to ask questions, they can find a story and pull that out of people, and be comfortable talking to strangers and recording it. So that's, you have to have someone who can do that, or you're not going anywhere, right? So um,
Yeah. Yeah, and then finding guests and sort of handling the rescheduling for any B2B podcast that has interviews, right? So guests like yours and mine, Chris. I mean, I think both of us are aligned that, this is probably one of the most challenging things as you start out. I would say it becomes less challenging as you progress along because, people know the show, and that you might actually have people who send guests your way, which, honestly alleviates some of the burden of having to find people. Um, but, still finding people and, knowing how to engage them and say, look, I'm not trying to sell you something. I'm, truthfully wanting to have an interview with you, on a podcast is a bit challenging in the beginning, because oftentimes people are trying to think about, what's in it for them, given that time is valuable. And if you have say no viewers or listeners and you're just getting started, it's gonna be a challenge trying to find those guests. And I'll have a couple tips, but I wanted to give you a chance, Chris, to comment on this one, because I know we both sort of agree on this one.
right. I think I started out with the first three, or at least three out of the first four guests on my podcast were people that I knew pretty well.
Yeah.
But they weren't just friends. They were friends from the industry who had significant things to say. And that got some momentum going. And if it wasn't one of the first three, the fourth person was someone on LinkedIn who had commented on some of the things I was posting around those initial episodes. So that was the first non-friend who was on, and then the ball kept rolling from there. The challenge for many companies is maybe people don't want to be perceived as promoting your company, so you have to convince them that that's not what it's about. I mean, of course, your podcast is a branding effort on your part, but they're not going to be asked to, shill for you or whatever. You just want to hear their opinion. So it's worthwhile for them. But the other challenge is those interesting people are often busy, and it's very easy for them to push it out and say, you know what, something came up. I can't do it this week, and I can't do it for the next 2 weeks. Just getting that flow going, which is why you want to start with a handful of episodes pre-recorded, so you can kind of have a buffer in there. But I tell all my clients that getting a steady flow of guests should be, their top priority, because that's the thing that's going to trip them up.
Yeah, and for me, I started with, so I had somebody that sort of started to plant this seed of recording a conversation that I had with them, as the initial person that planted the seed in my mind for having a podcast. I mean, I wasn't even thinking this way, but I was a brand new consultant trying to figure out how I'm going to stay engaged in the industry. And so I was interviewing more or less leaders, talking to them about the challenges that they have with their companies and things like that. And from that, at the end of the conversation, somebody had said, I wish I would have recorded this. So once I put all the pieces together for the podcast, I went back to that same individual and I said, hey, you want to go back and record it? We'll record it for everybody. So I lined somebody up that way The other thing that I've been very successful at is if you know somebody that's either been at a conference on a panel or has published an article. I mean, if you started back in the very beginning of my podcast, a lot of them were aligned to articles that were released for these people. So if they're out talking about themselves, most likely they would appreciate any additional PR. And so, that seemed to also draw additional people in as well with regards to wanting to be guests.
That's a great strategy as well. And don't think that just because the article has been published that the topic is done,
Right.
right? That person who wrote the article or was featured in the article uh, is looking to tell that story over and over again in as many places as possible. I mean, if you listen to celebrities making a tour of the podcast world, they're essentially telling the same story all the time. There's no reason why people in business couldn't do the same thing. Audiences don't overlap completely. You
Right.
just want more and more people to hear it. So, um, yeah, don't. I think looking at articles and speaker lists from events is a great source of finding people and a topic at the same time.
Yeah, and given the sort of scrolling nature of most of our social media, I mean, most people are going to scroll past a lot of different things anyway, and so having a podcast that sort of saves that throughout time actually could be beneficial to the individual as well, because from their website they can redirect people to that moment as well, and so yeah, I think that's a great point. In terms of audio quality, I would say it is one of the things that initially is something that has to be thought about. But honestly, given some of the technology that we have, our computers oftentimes will record things. Good microphones are around. Both Chris and I have decent audio equipment as well. But it's primarily because of what we do. And then I sort of encourage guests. I'd love to hear your perspective on this one too, Chris. Is I encourage guests oftentimes if they have AirPods, use them because they do a pretty decent job both from a listening side and from a microphone perspective.
Yeah, I would say AirPods are typically sufficient given reasonably good editing software, which is certainly available. That's sort of the minimum. The one thing you don't want is someone recording right into their laptop. That's
Right.
probably the worst possible case. When I started, I mailed a headset to every guest I had. It was part of
Oh
my
my.
marketing budget. I just got them on Amazon, and it's $25 each, and sort of a branding effort on my part in one way, but also um, just part of the budget. But since the pandemic, first of all, a lot of people got their own headsets, and it doesn't take much. A good microphone, well placed. I mean, a reasonable headset microphone, well placed, can sound great. You don't need to have super awesome equipment, but there's sort of a minimal level of sound quality that is important. So you may have seen or heard the example, like a person will watch a movie with bad video and good audio, but they won't watch a movie with great images and crappy sound. And
Right.
it's true.
Yeah.
They're going to spend 30 minutes with that sound in their ear. If it's not good, they're not going to listen. But it's not hard to get to the spot that's plenty acceptable. So you don't need to overthink it, but you do need to think about it.
Yeah. You want to cover the next one?
Sure, review and approval. So some people have concerns about this, whether their company will let them be on a podcast, does it need to be reviewed, and so on. My personal policies, I don't send out my podcasts except for clients. Um, so my guests don't really get a chance to review what we're doing, right? I mean, I'm not going to ask them anything about intellectual property. They shouldn't tell me anything about it. However, if you're in a situation where your company requires that you're going to have a review and approval for all the episodes you put out, it's very easy to get a transcript. And so people could listen, but they should just look at the transcript. And the only editing you can really do on a podcast is to take something out that you don't want in there. And so it should be pretty straightforward and it's a one-time thing, as opposed to sending around, let's say you wrote, a brochure or some other piece of written content. It gets bounced around. Everybody has an opinion. It goes to legal. They have an opinion. And then you're going to rework it after you take something out. The great thing about a podcast is don't say that. Delete, done.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a bit tougher whenever I do all of my podcasts live, right? So they go out live on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. It's a bit tougher. I have had companies, ask whether or not if they could review and approve. And I sort of remind them that, typically we just do everything live. I think, one, I've had people come back and want to edit little fine points inside of a podcast, not necessarily kind of the broader, hey, I said the wrong thing. And so because of that, I just primarily don't do it. But at the same time, it's something that, I think a lot of companies, especially if they're, public and their stock could be impacted by something that gets said. They would definitely want, to have a little bit more time rather than having it go fly out there live as if the person
Right.
were on MSNBC or something.
Yeah, that's completely reasonable. I understand that. I don't want to even get close to those situations. So if that's a risk, definitely they should review it. But otherwise, you have people out there talking to customers or whoever all the time. Can't watch everything. But
Yeah.
I understand from
Yeah. And then a definite obstacle as well is editing and distribution. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the technology around this, in the very last episode. But one, for very little money, I would say a month, right? You could have somebody that's editing your podcast and essentially, plugging it into the capability to have it distributed as well. So, yes, this is an obstacle, but to me, the ways to overcome it is one, go learn. So, I certainly didn't know anything about this whenever I first got started. There were a couple of people that I reached out to as I, got going whenever I had, if you listen to early episodes, I had sort of a high pitched whine that would come, occasionally. There was a lot of the S sound, being picked up by the microphone, that both pops and clicks and other things, removing all of that stuff, is kind of a challenge. But again, good editing software anymore sort of helps me, cut down the time on being able to do that anymore.
Yeah, most of the editing is sort of a one-click process. I've done every level from nothing, which is sort of I've come back to that standard, very little editing, unless I have a sidebar conversation that we're going to take out. And then distribution is just something, whatever kind of content you're making, you should really think about how you're going to get it out and different ways to get it out, and not just the whole podcast, but little bits of it, distributing those in as many places as you can, which we'll talk about in the next episode, to get people to come back and listen to the whole thing. That's really it. It's not a super difficult obstacle, but these are things you should be thinking about and we'll have to put some thought into.
Yeah. So maybe we just talk really quickly again about how we can help, Chris, and then sort of wrap things up and see if there are any questions from the folks that are on live with us. So you want to start?
Yeah. So my business is helping people create content. I like to say that the podcast is not the end product, it's the starting material, because there's so many things you can do with that conversation in terms of writing an article based on the transcript and cutting out little video clips like I just mentioned and sharing those on social media, and even text pull quotes with the static images. Lots of ways to put it out there. And I can help, I have helped people with everything from simply hosting a podcast where I ask the questions and someone else does all the editing, to hosting and editing, or getting you set up, really thinking about a lot of the things that were obstacles on the last page, kind of a workflow that you can adopt and get into. And I actually have a client now I'm sort of training, sitting in on the episodes. So I'm coaching on the interview process after the fact. I don't really interrupt the interview, but I make some notes and teaching them about the editing workflow. So the whole spectrum around interviewing and publishing content is the simplest answer.
Yeah. And one of the things that I would say that, that I'm really focused on with companies that I sort of work with is, how do we build an audience for you? You can go to lots of places. If you wanted a captive audience of people that where somebody else has already built an audience. If you wanted them, similar to me, right? So somebody comes to me and wants a podcast, it's not a problem for me to do that. Chris, you and I have talked about this. So to my website for Life Science Success, there's like 16,000 visitors every month. So it's good size of, the overall community that comes there. In addition to that, there's a few thousand people that download the episodes in lots of different ways. And that audience really is an audience that somehow is tied to me. It's tied to what I've built inside of Life Science Success. But now think about that from your company's perspective. If you had a captive audience that on a weekly basis, you're sort of putting out content and you're building this audience, that overall anything that you sort of submit to them, they're getting, as well. It can be overall beneficial to businesses. And so, we focus a lot, I know, in the clients that I have as well, on what do we do to build your audience? Because it's not about, sort of me or what I'm doing as a part of it. It's how do you capture the audience that you need and want? And then, best leverage that, audience for, again, attracting people to your company, to your services and things like that without it, being a strict sales pitch as well. And so, so that's sort of, what, I've helped companies through, and, yeah, happy to have conversations about that as well. So are there any questions from the audience? We have just a couple people that are on, and be happy to sort of capture anything that you have. I'll ask that question. I know that there is a delay between us asking the question. I think we covered that the last time as well. So, but happy to take any questions that the audience has as well. In the meantime, Chris, it sounds like you've had really good interview that's coming up as well that people should try and look up on your show.
Yes, I've got a whole lineup of good interviews coming. Some of them in the can, some of them have signed up for interviews. But tomorrow's episode, is a biotech startup. It's Camina Bio. There's no secret to that. They do de novo DNA synthesis, so creating full length genes, de novo complicated sequences. But the real story is about how they got started. I'll give you a little teaser. They got enough money to rent a lab, but they had no furniture. And then they had another meeting with one of their other first investors in the lab, and the founder had to bring his garden furniture with him so they had something to sit on. And they got money out of that meeting. So, and then the story, is a roller coaster ride, as you can imagine, from there, ups and downs, but well on their way. It's a pretty fun story.
Show up with your lawn chair to the investor meeting. That's
Your
great.
folding camp chairs, and have a seat. Here we are.
Yeah. And I'm not seeing anything come back in from the audience. So, so I think we'll just wrap up here. We're at time. And one of the things I would like to encourage people to look at throughout the week. So in the last episode of this that we had, there was a week's worth of content that came out of that one episode. I know that people oftentimes think about a podcast as being one thing, but as Chris has highlighted over and over again, it could be, chopped up into smaller little tidbits. It can also be, put into an article and things like that. And so I would encourage people to kind of watch both mine and Chris's feed throughout the week. And then we'll be back in 2 weeks with the third one, where we're going to talk about, equipment and how to get this done.
Sounds looking forward to it.
All right. Thanks so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.